Thanks, Peter. I want to begin with a story, a true story from my time in King's Cross that introduces this concept of the restorative Christ that I'm going to be saying a little bit about. And don't worry, this won't be a heavy theology lecture. It'll be more of an overview of some of the pieces of the puzzle as it's come together for me over the last decade or so. But I tell this story because people like Nikki, who I'm about to introduce, have actually been my teachers. I've been privileged to be a student of some of the best theologians in the world, like Miroslav Volf, but it's also people like Nikki, who I met in King's Cross, who has taught me just as much about Jesus and justice. So let me read to you from my book about Nikki. In the book, she's renamed for publication. Her real name is actually Nikki, although very few people call her by that name, as we'll work out. And she was really my first experience of what it's like to try and love a prodigal. We all know the story of the prodigal. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But some of us have actually had to live into the reality of that story and try and have to be the father for a prodigal. Nikki was the first person for me where I had to learn what it was like to live with and love a prodigal. I was one of the few people who ever called Nikki by her real name. Prodigals are anonymous because away from home, no one bothers with the past, including names. My first real conversation with Nikki was planning the memorial service for her husband of 6 years who had died of an overdose. It was 2 years after his death before Nikki felt ready to hold his memorial. So before knowing the contours of her life story, I sensed that Nikki knew deeply the pain of grief and loss. Prodigals are hurting because away from home, no one cares about the past, including relationships. Her life was marked by sin, pain and brokenness as she sought forgiveness, healing and wholeness. Part of Nikki's journey into forgiveness, healing and wholeness was a decision to be baptised. Her formal education had ended in her early teens, explaining her low level of literacy. Nikki's street education, however, explained her fierce intelligence, her savvy intuition and stubborn independence. None of my extant resources used in preparing adults or teenagers for baptism or confirmation would suit. So we started by reading C.S. Lewis's The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe together as her baptism preparation. Nikki understood the imaginative world of Narnia and the implications of citizenship in another world, as well as anyone I've met who has read Lewis's book. It proved to be the perfect preparation. And so the following winter, on a bitterly cold morning, I baptised Nikki in the freezing waters of a campsite pool in the southern highlands of Sydney. The affirming smiles of Peter and Dorothy Miller, who were staying with us from Scotland's Iona community and standing poolside, provided the necessary encouragement for full immersion. So after a couple of years of relative stability, Nikki managed to find independent shared accommodation, and we were invited to dinner in her new apartment with her flatmate and best friend Susie. But after years of living on the street and becoming so accustomed to dependence on the generosity of others, Nikki and Susie had forgotten a basic rule of hospitality. It's the hosts who provide the food. We laughed together at their oversight and with empty stomachs enjoyed an evening in their sparsely furnished apartment. This prodigal daughter was now remembered, named and embraced in a new home. Nikki was justly restored and reconciled with the Heavenly Father and the Christian community, or so I thought. My most poignant memory with Nikki, however, was the night, a couple of years after that meal, the meal without food, that we learnt that Susie had only an hour earlier also died from an overdose. We were gathering for Streetwise Church in the Rough Edges Community Centre where I was pastor. And that night, as part of our worship together, we wrote a song for Susie, which a few days later we performed at her funeral. Understandably, Nikki's life spiralled downwards. Weeks, sometimes months, would pass before I would see her again. To be honest, I sometimes wondered what words I would say at her funeral. Living and loving a prodigal, I was discovering, was living in fear of that phone call. Your son or daughter is dead. One day, Nikki was back in my office again, sitting in the same place that we'd planned her husband's memorial, the same seats from which we'd escaped to Narnia together, where we'd sat in shock the night of Susie's overdose. Intuitively, I knew things were not going well for her. Many unspoken questions swirled in my mind. Was she back on the gear, injecting drugs? Was she back on the game, street sex work? Was she back with her boyfriend, usually the pimp or the dealer or both? Nikki wanted to borrow $20 and promised to pay me back within the week. Now, I'd been asked for money thousands of times before. Some of my colleagues were inspired by my strength to say no when I needed to and wisdom to say yes when I wanted to. This was one of those occasions when I wanted to say yes, but our church had developed a policy, you can understand, in the middle of King's Cross, a good policy that clergy and other staff did not hand out cash. Like all the clergy and staff, however, I'd sometimes break the rules for one or two people. Another hard lesson in living with prodigals. They make a habit of getting in under your skin and can be hard to say no to. Nikki was one of those people I'd been willing to break the rules for, and she was counting on my generosity again. But Nikki knew me well and immediately sensed my hesitation at her request. Her accusations began. Don't you trust me after all we've been through? A dozen thoughts crowded my mind. Giving on the streets to strangers is easy compared to this. But how could I give her the money? I strongly suspected it would be shot into her arm within the hour. But I was torn. How could I not give her the money, given the friendship we'd shared and the generous God I followed? Deeper theological questions remained half-formed in my mind. What does following Jesus look like at this exact moment? How can I be compassionate like Jesus showed compassion? Should I give her the money? Social historian Natalie Davies has identified 3 basic modes for relating: the coercive mode, the exchange mode, and the gift mode. I sensed that Nikki was taking illicitly. Consequently, I felt coerced. I wanted to give generously, but felt certain my compassion was naive and would be quickly turn into the poison of heroin. Now, many fathers, mothers, sisters and brothers have shared the dilemma: how to respond with wisdom and compassion to a prodigal. The conclusion to this encounter with Nikki is not among the proudest moments of my pastoral career. I record it here because I need to be truthful about how I responded. And furthermore, it illustrates the desperate measures taken by those living and loving prodigals. As a compromise, I settled for Davy's exchange mode by effectively bargaining with Nikki. I'll give you something, but I'm going to take something as well. I took a $20 note out of my wallet and I held it in front of her. I announced that I was reluctantly giving her the money. Then, with words that I had not planned, and certainly I'd not learned at either Moore College or Fuller Seminary, I told her I was putting a curse on the $20 note. If she used that $20 to inject drugs, it would be the worst shot she'd ever have. My intention, I think with the benefit of hindsight, was that my curse would deprive her of the usual pleasures she derived from the heroin. But as those words left my mouth, I felt 1 part priest and 4 parts witch doctor. Now it was Nikki's turn to hesitate. We were back in the exchange mode. For her to refuse my generosity was an admission that she intended to use the money for drugs. But to accept the $20 and not use it for a shot was beyond her control at that point of her life. In exchange terms, it was lose-lose for both parties. The subsequent years proved to be a turning point in our friendship from which it would take nearly a decade to recover. Many years later, Nikki admitted that she did use the $20 for a heroin shot, and it was the worst hit she'd ever had, ruined by guilt and remorse. Sometime later, Nikki received a victim compensation payout of nearly $100,000. Various people, including a solicitor offering pro bono work for our church and community, had encouraged Nikki to place a proportion of the money in a trust fund. Nikki could maintain control of her money, but it would be less accessible than a regular bank account. She'd have to be more thoughtful about how she used it. But Nikki never signed the trust deed. So one perfect day, or so it seemed, the money simply appeared in her bank account. Weeks later, I managed to find where she was staying, by this time in a seedy boarding house in the back lanes of the Cross. All the money had been spent in 6 weeks of truly prodigal living. We met in a sleazy nightclub on the main strip of the Cross. The occasion I was wearing my clerical collar. Nikki was dressed in her working girl best, dazzling with bling from her 6-week spending spree. I could appreciate the humour of the situation, all those jokes that begin with the line, "Have you heard the one about the priest and the prostitute?" But more profoundly, as we sat together, humiliated, both of us, I prayed and wondered, what will bring this prodigal safely home? And so what I want to share with you tonight is my journey into finding at least part of the answer to that question. What will bring a prodigal like Nikki home? Or as Sean asked us earlier, what will bring mercy and justice to a land like Syria? We all know the short answer is Jesus, and that's exactly right. But as a scholar and as a theologian, I need to be able to do a bit better than that. And so what I want to share with you tonight is the pieces of the puzzle as they came together in the answer that I now call the Restorative Christ. A way that brings both Jesus and justice together so that prodigals like Nikki can come home. And the implications for those of us who want to follow Jesus but see justice in the lives of people like Nikki or lands like Syria. So let me give you a brief overview now of this restorative Christ, and it involves 4 parts. 4 visions of Jesus with 4 types of justice, and then some implications for our discipleship. The first, based on the passage I've been alluding to, the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15, is a compassionate Jesus. And we don't go very far in the Gospels without discovering Jesus is full of compassion. And this story is perhaps one of the best stories, the story of the compassionate waiting father who welcomes the prodigal home in that story. What kind of justice does that story describe, though? Some people think there's no actual justice. The prodigal simply welcomed, seemingly forgiven. Some say there's no cost or atonement in that story. The father just freely forgives. I don't have time with you to go into this story in detail, you know it well, but just let me say a few things about the cost of compassion, the cost of forgiveness. And we think about this father, and I see 3 points that cost him a lot to be that forgiving, to be that compassionate. The first is at the beginning of the story. This son actually had no legal right to claim what he asked for. In fact, it was an insult. And the father, by his rights, could have sent the son away at the beginning of the story in shame for even making such a bold request. But the first thing that it costs the father is for the son to have freedom. He allows the son to take his share of the inheritance and go off. Those of us who are parents, particularly those of us who are parents of children who have left home, know sometimes the grief and pain of even a good parting, of sending children off into the world. But a painful parting, a shameful parting like this costs the father. Don't let anyone tell you that this story didn't cost the father anything. And then we know when the son comes home, the cost to the father's shame. It was one thing that this son had gone off with the money and spent it all. The real shame for the father in that culture was that the son came home again. Yet the father welcomes him, we know, with the ring and the robe and the fatted calf. Almost like a Facebook status update. My prodigal has come back. But the third thing, and this just astounds me, the third part of the story, the father is prepared to risk his relationship with the elder brother in order to welcome this prodigal son home. The story ends, doesn't it? We know, a perplexing ending with the elder son standing outside. But if that's what it costs, this father is prepared to pay that price in order to be compassionate. And so what we have in this story is a compassion, but it's a costly compassion, a forgiveness, but a forgiveness that comes at a great price. And so the first thing we see is there is justice in this story, but it's a justice that is accompanied by reconciliation. The prodigal son is reconciled with his father. And so the compassionate Jesus is a Jesus who offers justice with reconciliation. We find that so difficult. We know that mercy and justice kiss, as it says in the Psalms. But I look at a place like Syria that Sean was talking about, and I become a bit schizophrenic. At one point, I just want the world's harshest justice on some of the evils that are perpetrated by various people like IS and others. And then I oscillate and I swing and I just want mercy for that land. And sometimes I don't know if I want either or both. In the compassionate Jesus, justice and reconciliation come together. How though? How is that possible? Well, the second, and I'll skip over the implications for discipleship, the second part is because Jesus is consistently non-violent in his life and teaching. We know this at every point where his followers wanted him to take up arms against the Romans, lead a revolution, he said no. Most obviously there in the garden when Peter took up a sword. And Jesus said, "Not this way, Peter." And so Jesus offers us a justice without retaliation. This is so difficult for all of us, isn't it? Even as followers of Jesus. When someone wrongs me, my instinct is to want to get even. And I'm talking about insignificant little wrongs. Not serious wrongs like abuse and things like that. But someone cuts in front of me in the traffic or pushes in front of me in the queue to get coffee. And I fantasise about all ways of getting even, about cutting in front of them or doing something. It's embarrassing if I have to admit it, but I know you're like me, fortunately. Jesus offers us a justice without retaliation that says no to revenge. We see this particularly in some of his famous teaching, like the turn the other cheek in Luke chapter 6. So the justice of the non-violent Jesus is a Jesus without retaliation. For us, and I will talk about this, we need to then be able to do things differently when people wrong us. We need to be able to remember rightly. You see, when that person cuts me off in the traffic. Part of why I justify my plot for revenge is I imagine all the other evil things this person does. And I don't remember myself or them properly. I don't even see them as another human being. I see them in ways that are quite distorted. Well, that's a silly, insignificant example, isn't it? But what about those relationships that matter more to us? We can do the same thing. We need to be able to remember rightly. We need to be able to see people as they really are. We need to be able to desire mercy, forgiveness, and compassion like the compassionate Jesus. Third thing we see about Jesus, and what I'm doing, if you've noticed, I'm looking at what Jesus taught, how Jesus lived, and now I'm thinking about how Jesus died. That's in Luke 23. We know that Jesus lived and died for others. This was actually the great insight of the scholar Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who stood up to the Nazis in World War II and was very involved in the underground seminary movement of the Confessing Church. Bonhoeffer's great slogan was, Jesus was the man for others. And Jesus taught love for enemies, but he also, importantly, died for his enemies. And Luke describes that in his account of Jesus' death. Jesus crucified there between two criminals. So if Jesus lived and died for others, we have here a justice that, importantly, that is only justice with repentance. And it's in the story of that second wrongdoer, that second criminal beside Jesus. We see how this plays out. The first wrongdoer wasn't interested. He joined in the general mocking, didn't he? Remember the story? The soldiers, the crowd, even the mocking sign from Pilate, King of the Jews. But it's the second wrongdoer. He says, hang on, wait a minute. We are here justly condemned for what we do. But this man has done nothing wrong. And then the first time in Luke's gospel, apart from demons, the first time another person addresses Jesus by name. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Just think about those words for a minute. Jesus, remember me when you... Normally, it's the victims of wrongdoing who want to be remembered, who feel like they're forgotten. When someone does something wrong against you, one of our fears is no one will notice, that the wrongs will never be righted. So it's when we have the wrong thing done against us, we want the world to know. We want it to be remembered. Wrongdoers have nothing to be gained by being remembered. In fact, when you do the wrong thing, what you hope, first of all, is no one will notice, and if someone notices, you hope they quickly forget. Wrongdoers generally have nothing to be gained by wrongs being remembered. And here we have this amazing thing. Next to Jesus, this guy says, I've been justly condemned. I deserve to die for the things I've done wrong. I hang here and it's justice. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Where did that come from? Part of the answer I'd like to suggest, the text doesn't tell us exactly, is that if the sign above this guy, this Jesus guy's head is true, he is a king, here is the King of the Jews, and he heard Jesus' first prayer, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Maybe he's put together the two together. Maybe thought, if this guy is a king, it's a kingdom ruled by forgiveness. If that's true, I want in. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. The words of repentance. And we remember, don't we? We know Jesus answered, today you'll be with me in paradise. So the Jesus for others shows us that justice and repentance go together. It's not automatic. There's repentance at the heart of creating justice. The fourth part is an embracing Jesus. A Jesus who actually doesn't just bring justice and reconciliation together, but a justice that actually repairs the harm done by wrongdoing. And I see this in the story of the risen Jesus on that Damascus road with Saul, where Saul hears a voice, sees a light. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? That dramatic encounter again that we know so well, where Jesus is actually able to name and at the same moment forgive Saul's wrongdoing. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And in that moment, Saul is embraced by the Jesus whose church he was persecuting as he found his way to Damascus in order to persecute the followers of Jesus. Finds himself embraced by what he thought was his enemy. And so these four parts of the story of Jesus in his life and teaching, compassionate Jesus, a nonviolent Jesus, in his death and resurrection, a Jesus for others, and embracing Jesus. They're the four parts of what I call the restorative Christ. A restorative Christ that brings the person and work of Jesus, the life, death, resurrection of Jesus together with the work of justice. What kind of justice? Not an easy justice, no. A justice that must always be with reconciliation. A justice that refuses to retaliate. A justice that must include the repentance of wrongdoers. And finally, a justice that is prepared to repair the harm done by the wrongdoing. And I haven't explained that very well from the Saul story, but it's in the book and I'm probably going on a bit long. But one of the things I think, and I write about this in the final chapter, one of the things I think has made reconciliation with Indigenous Australians difficult for us in Australia is we haven't been prepared to talk about how we repair the harms of the past. And this is even more pressing in some of the atrocities we see in places like Syria, as it was in South Africa, places like Rwanda, where terrible atrocities have gone on. What does justice look like in those places? And I think we need to be able to talk about justice that is repairing justice. Those willing to make amends. And again, this will be costly. Okay, Pete, I've probably said enough for now, and I think question and answer might be in order. So why don't you come up and...
Righto. Anybody got any questions to get us started? Well, whilst people are quickly thinking, let me start with a question.
Sure.
So as we take these four modes of justice,
Yep.
and in this room tonight we're surrounded by all of the flags of the world, and as a church what we're trying to do this week is focus on where we should be putting our energies and our resources to try and take the restorative Christ to the world where we can touch it.
Yep.
So how would we use that framework to work out what we should be doing as a church?
Well, one of the things I think it was alluded to with Sean's introduction, Syria and prayer, sometimes we're not sure. Does a place like Syria need the gospel, or does it need real sort of just aid and development and help with basic amenities? And I think we know the answer is both. Again, in shorthand, it's Jesus and justice that go together, but sometimes we get caught in this, we want to do more than just sort of, have missionaries who sort of go to places and talk about Jesus. We actually want them to do some good. We want them to do some works of mercy and justice. But we're sometimes afraid that if we support people who are doing those sorts of things, that somehow Jesus and the good news gets lost in that. And I know I feel that in trying to decide who I want to support and, where I'm going to support, put my mission dollars. So one of the things I think is we need a framework, not just for ourselves and in our inner cities, but for the places in the globe that need, yes, both Jesus and justice. Syria is going to be a perfect example. It's not simply that we need missionaries in Syria to tell people the good news of Jesus. We definitely need that. But there's going to be a whole lot of rebuilding that's going to need to go on. They're going to need all the things that missionaries historically did around schools and hospitals and a whole lot of things. And so I think that's one way we start to think into some of the issues confronting us in the world, is how do we actually effectively bring these back together?
Thank you.
Geoff, I want you to go back to your story about Nikki.
Yep, sure.
In light of what you've just said, what
Yep.
did you feel you did right and what did you feel you did wrong, taking into account what you've just said?
Yeah, people often ask about Nikki. Well, what was most important, I think, was for me to recognise at that point my lack of a well thought through response was because at that point I hadn't wrestled with how Jesus and justice go together. So I didn't know how at that moment to follow the restorative Christ. I think I could now better articulate, would I do anything differently? I don't know, that's sort of a hypothetical. But certainly justice needed to include those things, so let me go through them. I wanted to act justly in a way that would actually build our relationship and her relationship back with the church community, which had become fractured, become distant, and her relationship back with God. So that's the kind of justice I sort of intuitively wanted. I didn't want to be punitive. I didn't want to send her away and scold her for being back on drugs. So intuitively I probably got that part right. Probably the part I didn't get right is I think part of my response was a bit retaliatory. I felt like she was manipulating me or coercing me into giving the dollars, so this sort of cheap trick of holding the $20 out and putting a curse, I think, if I'm honest, was me sort of trying to get a bit even, or at least even the playing field. So I don't think I did well on that one. Was I really there for Nikki? Jesus is for others. Was I following in that Jesus was there for others? Look, I wanted to be, but I don't think I was. I was trying to be. I was being imperfectly there for her, but at that point I wasn't able to be there for her like I think Jesus was for her. In terms of the justice with repair, look, over the years I think, together we'd done a lot of that, so I'm not sure that in that moment that was as relevant, but certainly what I do know is in that moment I did a whole lot of harm that would take years again to repair. So my imperfect response, or my incomplete response at least, did a whole lot more harm in our relationship. Is that sort of what you are asking for? So what would I have done differently now, the benefit of all hindsight? I honestly don't know. One of the things I've learnt from more than 15 years in the inner city is, I'm probably a little bit wiser, but I'm not much wiser, and I can never know in advance what the thing is Jesus is asking me to do in that moment. I know I wouldn't take out a $20 note and put a curse on it. I wouldn't do that again. I know that much. Would I come up with a better response? Look, I'd hope to, but I don't know what it would be. I still find those situations difficult, particularly the people I know and love.
Hi, Sorry, I'm good.
Yes.
Hi, Geoff. My name's Daniel. I'm down here. Yeah, thanks for sharing with us tonight. I guess I just wanted to get your comment on justice, because it's one word, but it's pretty big.
Yep.
So when you were talking at the start and you were being interviewed, and you kind of talked about becoming aware of justice.
Yep.
That felt more like something to do with social justice, so I'm just going to explain my brain. Sorry. But then what you've kind of been talking about towards the end feels just like it involves everything, and so it would involve the way that I interact and relate to my mum, and the way that the restoration it's just, and I guess justice has to do with God's character and sin, so it's just This is like this huge thing, and so I'm not really sure how to interact entirely with
Yep.
that. I'm sorry, that's a bit of a weird
that's
question.
a good question. So in sort of very broadly, there's two ways people talk about justice. Some people talk about justice as right order. So the way to get justice in Syria is to have a stable government that is fair and just, and that will bring justice to people. That's the way you get justice, through right order. Others say, well, that's nice in theory, but the problem is that actually doesn't often deliver justice on the ground, particularly for people at the margins. So others talk about justice as right relationship. So the way we get justice is by people relating rightly to each other. Don't worry about your structures and your governments and your right order, get relationships right. I think we see both in the scriptures. There is both God's right order, God's kingdom, but there's also right relationship. So I mean both when I talk about justice, and I think my journey into justice has at times learned about learning from both of those. So yes, certainly much bigger than social justice, although certainly working in a place where there was very disadvantaged people compared to what I'd experienced, opened my eyes to issues of justice that had previously not been of concern to me. So people with severe mental health issues, people who are homeless, people with addiction, things like that. This was a new world to me, so that was more in the social justice. So that sort of opened my eyes to the issue. But when I talk about justice, I want to include both dimensions, because I think both are there. And it doesn't map on exactly, but we know that there are two words, but particularly in the Old Testament, sometimes translated righteousness and sometimes translated justice. And so this is where we get both senses are important also in Scripture. Is that helpful, or? Yeah.
Maria. Oh.
Hi, Geoff.
Hi.
Could you say a little bit more about your last comment about the reparative work, or the sense of how to repair the damage done to Indigenous peoples in Australia, and also where Christians stand in that, and should we be at the forefront of that?
Thanks. Yeah, so for those who know, part of what's in the background of my work, my research, is a concept called restorative justice, which I became familiar with in my work in the inner city. Things would happen in our community, people would get violent or abusive, and apart from calling the cops, we didn't know what to do. And so someone said, you need to actually learn some restorative justice. I can remember, it's more than a decade ago, first time we had training, and there was just such deep resonance with my Christian faith and convictions. I later learned that the guy who was doing the training was a very godly Catholic man, often called the cop from Wagga in restorative justice circles. Terry O'Connell has become a good friend. And one of the principles of restorative justice is, and the model is basically the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where sort of victims and offenders come together, talk about what's happened, what harm's been done, and importantly, what needs to happen to make things right. That's that concept of repair. And so justice is not just addressing the wrong or naming the wrong or being forgiven from the wrong, but actually putting things right. I talk about this in terms of post-reconciliation justice. I think being reconciled with our enemies or with those who we've wronged gives us a motivation to want to put things right. That's the Christian framework. And so Saul gets up on the Damascus road and goes into Damascus, the place he was going to persecute. He goes there and is baptised and healed of his blindness by Ananias, a leading figure from that community. And there's an interesting, in verse 16, if you've got your Bible there, or look it up when you get home, Acts chapter 9, verse 16. Part of Saul's call there, yes, he's called to be apostle to the Gentiles. He's also told what he must suffer for Jesus' name. There is a continuing burden, if you like. He's been doing the sort of persecuting, he's been making others suffer for Jesus' name. Now that burden becomes his. As he's reconciled with the risen Jesus, he's reconciled with the community in Damascus, he now must suffer for Jesus' name. There's a sense in which I think, yes, particularly as Christians, we mustn't be afraid of looking at what needs to be done to make things right. So one of the issues I'm passionate about, again from the Indigenous people I know, and just the continuing grace and hospitality that Christian Indigenous people have continued to show to me, I feel a burden to make things right. And I talk about in the last chapter of the book some sort of proposals for how we might go about that. Is that enough to sort of, or do you want to come back at me again? I sort of feel like I've only maybe half answered your question. Read the last chapter of the book, please. Yep.
Hi, God has me working on a regular basis with Nickies. And I think the biggest lesson that we as Christians need to learn is to love them unconditionally with no strings attached, which even means not pointing them to Jesus sometimes. That does come into the equation, but to just love them without having to preach at them first of all, you know what I mean? Jesus does come into that situation because they know what unconditional love is when they're really being loved. But so often we have strings attached, you know what I mean? And to love unconditionally is the call of Christians. With Jesus' love comes wisdom at the same time, you know. But if I have a motive in my heart that I'm going to do this for her so that she will come to Jesus or she will come to church, my motive is wrong. I have to love unconditionally, regardless if she accepts Christ. Now, if she rejects Christ, I'm still to love her. You see, otherwise I've got strings attached to that. That's conditional love. So as Christians, this is an area that we really need to grow in and learn how to love well.
Yep. Yeah, a couple of comments on that. So I think you're right. We often, and I think sometimes Christians can be guilty of this, our works of justice and mercy do have strings attached. In the youth work trade, it's called the bait and switch. So I invite young people to free pizza on a Friday night, but what they're actually going to get is a gospel presentation. I thought I was here for free pizza. What's all this talk about Jesus? Bait and switch. So we've got to be very careful in our works of mercy and justice, and not just bait and switch. So I agree with that. But also, partly for me to be authentic, part of my loving Nikki is my deeply held conviction that she knows the love of the Father. And sometimes, and this is where the other side, sometimes those who are doing great works of mercy and justice, they sort of shut that off. And I became confused about this. People are so passionate doing such great things in loving the Nickies, and yet they'd stop short of actually sharing that part of their love. So again, I want to try and bring them back together so that the love for Nikki includes the desire that she know the love of the Father.
Because that will heal her.
Absolutely. You know, that's ultimately that's the justice she needs.
That's it.
I can't love her unconditionally like the Father can. But hopefully my imperfect $20 note waving in her face, imperfect love can actually show her what a true love of the Father's like. A true love with no strings attached.
Geoff, in that song, the servant song, where it's of St. Francis, and he starts off saying, you know, brother, let me be your servant, let me be as Christ to you. But then he goes on and he says, pray that I may have the grace to let you be my servant. I've thought about that a lot, and is there a sense in which I encounter Jesus at the point where I am serving my fellow man, and that Jesus, through that person, is serving me? It's a sort of mystical, but I suspect that's where perhaps I meet Christ in a real sense, and that he he shows me, he teaches me through this person. I wonder if that's been some of your experience. And I sort of felt that maybe in some of your confessional comment that's how Jesus was also speaking to you in your spirit. In a desire to wish to see Jesus more meaningfully in the world. Some years ago, I went with a team from here, and we went to Uganda, and we were there to serve. But I was aware that I wanted to be open to how Jesus was serving me through them. I never really got a strong sense of how that was happening, but I suspect that it's there. That's where I meet him. Would you make a comment on that?
Look, I think I get part of what you're saying. I think it is... unfortunately, there is sometimes with this kind of discussion a little bit of sentimental nonsense, if I can be blunt. You know, people thinking they're going into these situations, whether it's the inner city or to Uganda, to sort of be Jesus to others. That's just nonsense. I can't be Jesus. And I'm not called to be. I'm called to follow him. So I think I want to really remind myself that I'm never called to be Jesus for others. And you also hear that, you know, I see Jesus in the face of, you know, the Nickies or that. Look, I kind of get what people are saying when they mean that. I think there's that sense of, yes, there's a mystical dimension to actually when you really are following Jesus into those hard places and encountering what really goes on there and seeing God's transformative power at work, that does have this. But I don't think Jesus is in Nikki any more than she's in me. The same call belongs to her as it does to me. Her call is to follow Jesus. So I just want to be careful about that. I don't want to dismiss entirely what you're saying, but I think sometimes people get caught up in some of the language that ultimately is a bit unhelpful. But certainly something profound has happened for me in my relationship with people like Nikki. And I was quite genuine at the beginning. She has been one of my teachers. That's not just the rhetorical technique of an author. I genuinely have learnt from Nikki. And I suspect something similar happened for you and does happen to people who follow Jesus in obedience into those difficult places of our world and our lives. It is profoundly transforming, and I don't want for a minute to underestimate that or be in any way dismissive of that, but I think we've got to be careful of how we describe it. And as I say, I'm a bit wary of sometimes the sentimental language that grows up around those experiences. I'd much want to keep talking about faithfulness and following Jesus and those sorts of things and the transformative power of God when we follow Jesus.
Right, I think we've got time for 2 more questions. No? Yes? A follow-up.
Sorry, it's me again.
Yeah.
I thought when you are in a church and when you go and speak to us like you are right now, you are speaking to all, inside the church, there's people with all different political leanings and also different issues that they care about, regardless of the politics of that. And so if you're looking at all those people and you were going to call them to justice and go, hey guys, I know you've got your agendas, but this is something that's really important that we should all be looking to and something that we can gather around and that'll drive us to action about things that really matter. What would be your kind of call in that way if you were trying to cut across that stuff to point us kind of forward?
Well, let me answer in this 2 ways. If I'm talking to the Geoff Broughton that existed up until about 30, I'd want to say, in your passionate commitment of following Jesus, don't be too blinkered because your world has been fairly safe and secure to issues of justice in your own city, in your own nation, in your world. And part of following Jesus is maybe for you personally, but certainly generally, is to follow Jesus into those places. You know, Jesus didn't say when I followed him that I'd always have a nice, cosy life. In fact, I think he kind of said something a bit different. And so that's what I'd say to the under 30 version of me. To not so much who I became, but the people I hung out with, I would say, in your passionate commitment to works of mercy and justice, do not forget that actually Jesus is, it sounds trite, but Jesus is the answer. Without Jesus, we can't do justice. You know, it is the restorative Christ that we need, that people need. And so to people particularly of no faith, I'd want to say to them, Christians have, yes, a mixed heritage, but actually have a long tradition of practicing a certain kind of justice in the way of Jesus. That needs to be taken seriously. You know, just because I'm a Christian, don't dismiss me. Just because there's a Royal Commission going on, don't dismiss me. Actually, there is a 2,000-year history of people following Jesus who have done works of justice, and then we can start rehearsing. You know, the story of hospitals, of schooling, a whole range of things where people, out of their commitment to Jesus, have actually done good justice. And so to people who perhaps don't share my faith commitment, I'd want to say, you know, you may not share my faith commitment, but you need to at least take seriously that people like me can do justice, have done justice, and can be just as committed to justice as you. Because sometimes, particularly on the lefty side, they want to dismiss Christians as not really on about justice. And I want to say, actually, that's not true. Have I got any close to what your answer is? Or not really? No. Sorry, I did my best.
Last question.
Yeah, hello, my name is Ben. I have a couple of questions. Is sometimes for a prodigal, it could be an imaginary injustice they feel. They may not be real, but they could also be real. They have been badly treated in the past. But in one way, everybody is robbed injustice because of sin in their life. Is that so? So everybody has been dealt injustice, as long as they don't know Jesus. I mean, you know what I mean? Thank you.
Yeah, I actually deal with this in my chapter on Jesus' death, so I'm going to have to try and be really disciplined here and stay brief. There is a true sense in which we are all wrongdoers. You know, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And I think that's the primary way in which we approach the death of Jesus. We see what Jesus' death means for me as a wrongdoer, and that's very strong in my tradition, the Reformed tradition, that we see in Jesus' death for me. What it means is Jesus died for me, a wrongdoer. But I don't think that's the full story. My clue in Luke's story is at the beginning and end of his story of Jesus' death, he talks about the women, the daughters that weep on the way, Jesus on his way to the cross, and at the end of the story after Jesus died is the women who followed him. They're the women, if we go back to Luke chapter 8, they're actually the model disciples. They followed him all the way to the cross. According to Luke, the only male still at the foot of the cross is the beloved disciple. All the others haven't followed Jesus faithfully all the way to the foot of the cross. It's actually the women who are standing there who see him die. And it says they perceive these things. Literally, they look and understand. So it's the women who have stayed who see something. Now, my question is, what role are they playing in Luke's story of Jesus' death? They're not there as wrongdoers. Yes, ontologically they are wrongdoers because all fall short. But there's a way to look at Jesus' death that's not only from the point of view of being a wrongdoer. And so I take my cue from those women in Luke's story of Jesus' death. And then I also think about the African Americans and their spiritual. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? You know the songs? Sometimes I wonder, tremble, 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 were you there? Think about the African Americans experiencing slavery and oppression. When they sang that song to each other, I don't think they were singing it to each other as wrongdoers. I think there's a way we can actually look at Jesus' death from the point of view as a victim. What does Jesus' death for me mean as a victim? And I know this has been enormously powerful for people who are victims. Not victims like me, I was being silly earlier with people cutting in front of me in traffic and stuff, but genuine, real victims, like some of the people in Syria, like people who have suffered horrific abuse at the hands of priests or loved members. I think Jesus' death says something to that, and my tradition, my Reformed tradition, has actually been weak on that. We've not been able to articulate well, what does Jesus' death mean for me as a victim, particularly genuine victims in our world? And both is true. So yes, Jesus' death primarily is for me as a wrongdoer, but Jesus' death can also be for those who are victims in our world. And I'd like to see my tribe do a bit better in that second, because I think that'll actually aid with the work of justice if we can introduce people to Jesus at death for them, not just as wrongdoers. Better finish with that, Pete.